Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar Ortiz, and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, a company where we help managers of remote teams to get the most out of online collaboration. You can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. Hello and welcome to episode 312 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, which is a What's Going On episode, but a What's Going On episode with a big theme. Our theme for today is more or less, is it remote work? Is it promoting inclusivity or inequality? So there's some of the things that are going on in our minds. It's also some of the stuff that we've extracted from the internet in a way, from online, from other conversations. And when I say we, I mean myself, Pilar Ortiz. Lovely to have you here. And of course, Maya Middlemiss. Hello, Maya.
Hello, Pilar. Hello, everybody. And indeed, there's lots going on in this important subject.
Yes, and I think if we don't give it space, and it's actually your thought around different remote workers and the experience they were having with the energy crisis. I didn't say that very well, which we covered in the previous What's Going On from August that sparked this. So yeah, let's see where we get to. But first, I have to say, before we go into the deeper subject, that today, Maya, I don't know how you feel, but I came into Zencastr, which is where we record our episodes today, and it looks completely different. Well, it looks very jazzy and black and stuff, whereas before it was like last century white in a way. But I've gone into the dashboard and it says, okay, now you can choose an episode. Is it a show? Is it it says playground now in this. And I'm thinking, I'm really empathizing with anyone who has to do a job and suddenly they turn up and maybe, I don't know, some app they use every day has suddenly changed.
Yeah, it's kind of a reflection of the fact that these tools are our workplace now in the digital world. And if you worked in an office and you came in and someone had changed all the furniture, painted the walls a different color, or put the tools you use somewhere you couldn't find them, it would be really annoying. And yet this happens all the time with software updates.
Yeah, and it's not our job to learn. I mean, it is, but you know what I mean. And I refused to have a play because I don't have time.
No, you're here to work, not play, really. Yes. You log in and want to use it. I don't know if it feels like software as a service, they've got to keep justifying that subscription by fixing things that aren't broken. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like that. Sometimes there are great improvements and, bring it on. We want that, but please don't change things for the sake of it, everybody.
Yeah. And I'm sure, it's a matter of just putting, now that I know that it has changed that much, I put aside some time to it, have a look, see what it is, see what I want. And then like you say, in a month, it won't be an issue.
And then they'll change it again.
Yes, no. Oh, good. So I think I rant over, of course, I hope that resonates with the listeners in some shape or form. This is such a huge topic. And I think that the diversity of where remote work has landed now, and it was already going that way before the pandemic, is just it's just creating all sorts of maybe unwanted or even effects that we hadn't thought of. Is amplifying some of the stuff that we were fearing. I mean, there's so much, and for me, just to be thinking about, as someone who's been in the space for this long, and thinking about some of the inequalities that this might be bringing about. I just wanted to bring about another conversation I had on LinkedIn, which was, it's not per se about this theme, but let me tell you, I just posted about the fact that I'm very aware of when some of our guests are not wearing headphones, or some people in meetings are not wearing headphones. And it's something that I really always think, people should be wearing headphones all the time in their meetings and when they're talking to someone online. And I posted about this, but I asked, why do you not wear headphones if you don't? And the range of replies was amazing. And it's really just, I'm not, that little thing I had that when I saw like someone was not wearing headphones, I'm like, forget it. That doesn't bother me anymore, because I've seen just the diversity of people's preferences around something this small, from like someone saying, well, actually, I don't hear very well, therefore I don't wear them, to someone saying, actually, I don't hear very well, therefore I wear them. I mean, that polarization to I hate earbuds, oh, I love earbuds, all of that. And so everyone internally experiences it differently. And then if we put on top everything external, I mean, we've got such a huge diversity of experience.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I suppose what it comes down to is just being conscious of it, or conscious of your contribution to the whole auditory experience in a meeting, because it really is one of those things where the worst sound setup affects everybody else and will probably make everybody else's meeting miserable. But as you said, there are so many things, even aesthetics. I was talking to somebody about this recently, about podcast recording, and saying that they hate it when people show up with full over-the-ear headphones for a video recording, because it looks much more natural if they use AirPods or just an open mic, if they have a decent directional mic to pick up their own sound, and they don't like people sitting in a video looking like they're in air traffic control or something. So it's
or in a radio program.
Yeah, I mean, I'm using over-the-ear headphones now because I think I get a better sound quality, but if I'm doing video, I'll probably be vain and put my AirPods in.
Yeah. So if there's that diversity around something that small, you can imagine everything further out. So let's expand the bubble. And I wanted to just start with so from the organizational level, and actually before the organizational, I saw a tweet today that somebody on Twitter pointed me to, and it's from Nick Bloom of maybe 2016, when he did that pilot with call service in China, where people worked from home and how the productivity employed so much there. And I really like this summary. It says working from home, and I like that he says that, not remote work, has stabilized into 3 groups. No working from home, 55% of employees, mostly in face-to-face jobs in retail, manufacturing, food service, etc. Hybrid working from home, which I imagine he means some days in the office, some not. 30% of employees, typically better paid managers and professionals. And then fully work from home, 15% of employees in support roles like IT and payroll. So we're already seeing this there's division in who can work remotely or work from home and who can't.
Yes, and a kind of stability. I mean, there are obviously wobbly lines, but there's no particular trend up or down suggesting that, dare we whisper it, we might be approaching some kind of an equilibrium somewhere. He talks about having stabilized into 3 groups rather than the continual mess of bubbling cauldron of change that we've been looking at the last few years. So it is interesting to try and draw out these trends.
Yeah. So we start to see that even the fact that some people can work remotely and some can't already starts to bring some sort of inequality, I think. But I mean, you could say that about almost anything. But I think that is, and many organizations are struggling with that. They're struggling with, actually, even within the same company, if you got people in factory and then people in HQ, or even people who are managing the people in the factory. So that's a struggle at the moment, that even within the organization, people are thinking, oh, we don't want to basically provide some people with flexibility and others not.
Yes, and it builds on the inequalities which were so highlighted during the pandemic, where lots of knowledge workers had the privilege of being able to work from home and in lockdown, whereas other people who were probably the lowest paid were deemed essential and therefore had to go out and carry on their work. So it's kind of following that pattern of, these are the people who still have that privilege or the choice of working from home or hybridly, whereas other roles are clearly settling into a pattern where people have decided they can't be done on a remote basis, and maybe they never will be.
Mm-hmm. So that's something to be looking out for. And I think within some teams, maybe, or within organizations, where what I'm seeing, when we're offering the opportunity to not work in the office to some people, but we don't know what to do about the others. I love what Daniel Pink has in his book Drive, where he talks about giving flexibility around time, task, technique, or team. So about what times you work at, is the flexibility around the task, what you do, is the flexibility around the technique, and is there flexibility around the team who you work with. And I can imagine that in some cases, even finding flexibility around that might be difficult, but I think it's time to become very creative in looking at our workforce as a whole and not just the pocket that is obviously gaining flexibility.
Absolutely, because people want it and they will go and find it for themselves. And this is clearly a reason why sectors like aviation and hospitality are struggling, because they're not doing this. People would rather go and work in the gig sector just to create that flexibility in their own lives of picking their shifts and their projects that they're going to work on. And they'll sacrifice the security of proper contracted work in order to find that flexibility, because I'm sure people do accept that there are things that can't be done in terms of flexibility of location, but there are all these other dimensions where a bit of imagination might be able to create a more equitable working experience across a big organization.
And I know that I do read sometimes people who say, don't get so hung up on talking about the work and just do the work. But I think this might also be an opportunity to look at what people's jobs consist of and maybe reevaluating whether some of the stuff that we've always done in this way, whether that can be experimented with, whether we can give autonomy over this. Actually, we thought this had to be like this, but are there any other options? And if there are, can people choose?
Yeah. And maybe if you feel like you've seen the whole world change so much around you, but actually your role and what you do hasn't, that could be an anchor and a feeling of stability. But there might also be a sense of being left behind in a world of flux, and that you ought to be at least part of the conversation about how things could pivot and evolve and maybe even get a bit better.
That's also a really important point, being part of the conversation, because sometimes even if directly we cannot be part of the change, maybe even just being asked about how the change of others is going to affect us, that might actually make us feel a bit more involved, even if we're afraid of what might come out. But then,
Yeah, I think fear is a big part of it. People are afraid of change. Organizations are afraid of starting things they can't finish. It's easier like to break the law, like P&O Ferries, and just fire everybody and then say, yep, we should have consulted, but we didn't. Things like the industrial action that's going on in the transport sector at the moment, people are afraid of having conversations where they have to say, all right, there's this huge inflation. We can't possibly match that in a pay rise. So it's better that we avoid the conversation. And I don't know, there's so much uncertainty that there is a sense of people looking around for the other party to make the first move or open negotiations. And it's a shame that it's come to that.
Yeah. So with all of that, we can see how the introduction and the fact that remote work is becoming mainstream can cause all kinds of inequality and even a sense of inequality. Because I think that's also the thing that when we're looking, for example, at self-determination theory, it's the sense of what's happening to us that is very important, and much more so maybe than even the reality. So that we start to see where that's coming from. And then, of course, we have one of the point that Nicholas Bloom made very subtly about the salaries of the people who can usually work from home. And I've got a quote here from Post-Corona, Scott Galloway's book. And one thing I picked out was So referring to work from home, its greatest benefits are being reaped by the already wealthy who have home office setups, childcare help, or other means of making money during lockdown. So, of course, that was referring to the pandemic and very much what you were referring to earlier, Maya. Remote work, and then look into the future, remote work will be a means of increased income inequality. 60% of jobs that pay over $100,000 can be done from home, compared to only 10% of those that pay under $40,000. This is a major contributor to the pandemic's disparate impact across income levels. And this really is what you were mentioning earlier.
It's an interesting contrast, though, to Nick Bloom's assertion that it tends to be the highest paid roles are actually taking on a hybrid appearance. So there's a sense that if you want to earn those really big salaries, you need to show your face occasionally in the office. Clearly, those roles, if they can be done hybridly, they can almost certainly be done completely remotely. And, as Galloway was saying, the jobs that pay over $100,000 can be done from home. They might as well be done from home. But there's this sense from what Nick Bloom was saying that people still feel they've got to show up sometimes. And it's more the sort of middle and support roles that are being done completely remotely. So that's an interesting trend as well.
Yeah, I mean, the reasons for being hybrid are also very, very wide. So I think that, yes, presenteeism might be one, but I think it goes much way beyond. And that is an important part. And it's, you might have a nice home office, but you want to get out. That could be one. You don't want to be anchored all the time in your home because you've been there. I find that, yes, today's Tuesday, yesterday was Monday. I've been home all weekend, so I went to the co-working. So I think that this is really interesting that the hybrid approach that Nick Bloom is saying, actually, the better paid managers, but they might also be the ones who want to leave the home.
Yes, and they've got that autonomy. Maybe they've got more flexibility over their shifts or how they plan their meetings or their work time and things like that, rather than somebody who's doing support work who has to be logged into a certain device or a certain screen for a fixed shift.
Yeah. So again, that's like, what does our work how remote can our work really be? How location independent? Because it's one thing to be saying remote work, the other is to be saying office or home, and that's it. So that's a really good point. The other thing I'm thinking about is that it's also, I think it's a legacy also of where we come from too, that we might not even feel like we are in the middle of things if we are not physically in the middle of things. And I think that some of those higher paid jobs that tend to be more managerial, that's what we thought being a manager would be. That's what it's been for so long. And yet, like you say, now we have the flexibility to do that. And so that's what we think our job is, being also more in the office. Yeah.
And it's combining with the social things as well that simply take a little bit longer to manifest, like the idea of moving house, which most people sort of didn't do immediately, that they found themselves working from home during the pandemic. I managed to move house during the pandemic. I don't recommend it, but it wasn't a very normal thing to do. But for a lot of people, what that might have done is unlocked an idea that takes a little bit of time to think about. And then you've got a rental lease coming up in a few years and so on. And so these second, third order effects can take longer to manifest and reshape the workforce as well as the local community.
I think we're really early. It's really early days as well. I mean, we've been having the conversation about remote work and the people it's leaving behind for a very long time, but not at this scale. And I'm preparing a talk on how remote work has changed over the last couple of years. And you know how during the corona, the horrible headlines were saying this was the biggest work from home experiment. And we were all like, no, it's not an experiment. I think now is the real workplace experiment, because now people are experimenting. Yes. And they're doing, and so now is the experiment. So now is where we can see what works, what doesn't work. If we do it this way, who can do it, who doesn't, what happens to society. I think now is the time to play.
Well, it's certainly not settled down yet, put it that way. There's still lots of experimentation going on, and let's hope that the organizations and managers realize that as well as the people wanting to take advantage of it themselves.
And that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of people thinking, okay, we're doing this. What do you see of that? Let's try that. That didn't work. There's a wonderful article, it's not in the show notes, by Hubble HQ, I think, where they've got a list of companies that have gone office first, hybrid, and remote first. The hybrid section is huge. And if you read through, you see this company, they did this and now they've stopped. They did this and now they've gone back. They did this, they've stuck to it. So organizations are really are playing, and it's...
Yeah, that's encouraging. It's good to see.
Yeah. No, I think it's good. But I mean, we then have the other side, but I'll wait. I'll wait for this one for a second. Just going back to the point by Scott Galloway, who wrote post-corona, still in the lockdown or in the huge pandemic time. So that's why I think also he was missing some of what came later. What I think is missing is this argument that we always had, and we used to talk a lot more before, of the socioeconomic change. So if really people do start, if the population does start to incorporate remote work more, then maybe cities change, maybe we have more repopulation. And I think that that's the point where actually you start to level off some of this income inequality.
Yes. And it's some of those things, it's so many different converging forces and trends anyway, that something had to give in London rental prices, for example, even long before the pandemic, is approaching an unsustainable point. And there's all these different influences. No one knows exactly how it's going to pan out, but some of these trends will take a lot longer to manifest. And it's going to be so interesting looking back in 10 years' time and just seeing how everything's reshaped itself.
I think it'd be really interesting to see what would happen if in an organization that suddenly becomes fully remote, lots of managers, imagine they used to live very near the head office in the middle of town, and actually they decide that they now want to live somewhere cheaper, somewhere more affordable, where they can make the most out of or just
more lovely and rural or beautiful or interesting.
And then maybe you don't need such huge salaries.
Yeah.
I think it would be wonderful just to see whether, of course, this is not going to happen, but I think that's not really coming into people's thoughts yet, is that actually maybe you need to be paying so much to your highest paid people because you're asking them to be very available and they want to live very close to the office. And then when you start saying that's not as important, then that's when you can start to have...
Then we can start to actually make those rewards and enhancements meaningful for the people who really do have to live there, the key workers who can't afford to live in London. And, maybe we can start to rebalance that a little bit. And the executives who can afford to be out somewhere rural and beautiful and work online don't need to earn quite as much London enhancement as the person coming in to run the cafe or maintain the infrastructure in the city.
I'm getting so depressed because this was the opportunity to look at this. And I'm just thinking, well, I am being very pessimistic. I think that maybe, hopefully, new generations come in with a different set of values and way of looking at the world. And maybe at some point it can change. I think that's my only hope, is like for...
Yeah, I don't think it has to be necessarily specifically articulated and decided about. No. I think this is one of those things that will just evolve anyway, as part of different pressures on hiring and property and all sorts of different things. Nobody's ever going to maybe dare say it out loud, but it's going to happen anyway, in the same way that all sorts of economic cycles come and go. So we can't predict it or control it. We can maybe try and observe it and suggest which way the trend might be going, but it doesn't mean anyone's ever going to admit to it.
Oh, I hope so. I hope it changes, but well, we'll see. I don't think I'm going to be here to see it. Let's put it that way. That's how pessimistic I am about it. But I am hopeful that eventually it will happen. We've also got the environmental issue as well, which goes hand in hand, and that might well give rise to all sorts of changes as well.
Yes.
And different ways of viewing the world.
Yes, well, having been having my morning walks this week under a rain of ash from local forest fires, there's an awful lot we need to fix about that as well.
Yeah. On the other hand, okay, so we've got that, and then we've got this. I mean, we only see the world from where we are, I think. And this is why, referring back to that LinkedIn question about the headphones, I was so glad I posted that, because it just that question of why do you do this, which is something that I don't do, really opened up my eyes for some stuff. And there's an article here in fortune.com, JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon rips remote work and Zoom as management by Hollywood squares. That's the first one, is you've got no clue about what remote work is if you think it's
what
being
management is.
Or what management is, actually. Yeah, you're completely right. You're completely right. Remote work management by Hollywood Squares. Yes, he's never heard of Trello. And then he says, and he says, returning to the office will aid diversity.
Yes, so I'm sure he's an expert in diversity.
Well, his
JP
point
Morgan's
is
famous for it. Well,
yes. I don't know much, but yeah, I imagine. But he's assuming that if you do remote work, which for all in his eyes means working from home, that's the first thing. You stay home all day and then you go out and you mix with the households next to you, which in his world probably all look the same, all do the same, all sound the same, all have the same conversations and all have the same points of view. He doesn't understand that actually you might live in a neighborhood where you have a mixture of people, or working from home might allow you to travel 40 minutes to play football the other side of town and mix with a completely different set of people.
Yeah, or it might give you more choice over how you choose to spend your time and with whom, rather than having that selected for you in the office. God, if that's the only way you can experience diverse interactions with different kinds of people, that's pretty tragic, actually.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be the issue, is that if people coming up with these blatant statements, of course, and this is headlines also, but reading the article, it really gave me that impression. This person just has not asked what it's like and what it can be like. And then in contrast, I was recording with Michelle Ong, who's a programmer, and she's been a remote worker for 10 years, and the interview will come out in October. And she was talking about how she's been for a very long time working completely remotely with global teams. And without me prompting her, because I just read the article, she said how amazing it is to meet such a diverse set of people when you're working remotely, because of her global connection. So I just thought it can be both. It can be both. And I'd heard this argument before that if sometimes going into the office, pretty much like going into, I don't know, I have to say that when I went to Imperial College, I saw people I'd never seen before. And I met with people from, my best friend there was from Pakistan. So I met people with all sorts of places. And then I went to Mount View Theatre School, which was a different set completely. So I can see why we spend so much time at work. So we're going somewhere, and in some workplaces, there will be a mixture of people. But that's not the only place where we live our lives.
No, but it's kind of a reminder, isn't it, of how for so many people it is, and people who talk about even the lack of social contact when they work remotely. It's arrogating such a lot of responsibility onto the workforce to find them their social circle, their future partner, their entire network of different cultures and environments. Really, work isn't supposed to do all this. You're supposed to do this yourself. You live in a community, you live in a world. We have communication tools at our fingertips, which previous generations couldn't have dreamed of. And if you really expecting your workplace to be your entire social and interconnected life, then I think that's really quite depressing.
Well, I think that's very tough, Maya.
Sorry, because, I have a rant now.
because having talked about diversity, we have to honor the diversity that I know many people, and I used to be one of them. And in fact, to be honest, if I am true, most of my friends from the last, actually, since I left university, I've met through work.
Yeah.
It's just that I don't go into an office. In fact, when I was going into an office, even part-time, one of my very best friends came out of that job. So I think that the recognition that there is but I think you're right that the narrative that is where we create our strongest bonds, and where we want to create the strongest bonds, that narrative is very strong.
Because it just needs to change, I think, a bit, just in terms of it. Work can't be responsible for all of these things. There is a bit of personal responsibility as well to extend beyond the network, or at least just be selective. You've met so many people through work. I've met so many amazing people through my work, and many of them have come to be friends. But it's not just because they were all standing in front of me. It's great that we can connect with so many different people from different places and cultures and backgrounds, that we can really extend our knowledge and our interests and But that's still down to the individual. It's not required to do the work in most cases, though it's great as a journalist when you get to ask lots of people lots of different questions. But we still have a social, personal responsibility to be an active member of society and seek out people who are different from ourselves and enrich our lives with different perspectives and backgrounds.
Yeah, and I think that it needs to be that diverse, and the offering and the narrative and the understanding. And what I'm hoping for is that the workplace will be that diverse. So people who only want to think about work and who are actually like, you know what, I am very happy going into the office, doing long hours, going out with my workmates, and that's it. They can find that place. And the other people who, right to the other extreme, where you just want to do your job, do your task well, and then forget about it and live another life parallel to your work life, that is possible as well.
Yes. It's all that flexibility, isn't it? Everyone's got to find their own unique blend.
Yeah. So, and meanwhile, though, we'll have all of that inequality. I mean, I'm thinking now of someone who has, because of how they live, where they live, who they are, actually loved going into the office because that is where they felt themselves. I mean, I'm talking about like the very, very lucky people who just, they fit in there, they fit the work. And then that might have changed because of the flexibility. Now their world has been turned upside down.
Yes.
And they're going to be left behind for a while.
And those people who they thought they shared that experience with might have other preferences and found other ways to fulfill their social needs. Or they could be push pressures. They could be in an unsatisfactory housing or an unhappy relationship at home. And it could be all sorts of things that are kind of driving people towards that workplace social life as well as drawing them in from it.
So that's another dimension I hadn't thought of, actually, when we're looking at the whole inclusivity, inequality, is where you get your social thing from. I mean, we've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we were teaching for ages at the understanding the workplace. And that middle one is social bonds. Yeah. So I think but I think for me, it's been the fact that there's been an assumption. The loudest voices have been assuming that the office is where we get that. We're actually the office, but also online with our colleagues online also. And then, like you say, around us. So the going actually not straying too far away from that. The other thing that I'm thinking is that, talking of social activities, actually, that when you think of the traditional office setup and how traditionally people have bonded socially outside of work, where I think a lot of bonding goes on inside of work, is what you do after work and how you bond, and how, especially I think in London, something that really strikes me is how the pub and consuming alcohol has been at the core of that. And I'm just hoping that accepting remote work in a way, and accepting that people work differently, that they want to work different hours and stuff, might start to get people to be more imaginative about that area.
Maybe, yes. Well, bring it on, because it's quite boring if you don't happen to drink. And it's all people want to do socially, whether that's related to work or not. At least if people are taking part in a social thing remotely in their Hollywood squares, they can bring a beverage of their own choice. It doesn't have to be alcoholic. And from a diversity point of view, it excludes all the people who might have religious reasons or health reasons and all sorts of reasons for not being part of that G&T culture.
Yeah. David Stoddard, I think, had a few examples of how they're trying to, how they're experimenting with people bonding in different ways. I mean, that is something that they're really designing, and I think they're being open, creative, and I think it's really great. But I was just thinking that's another one. Yeah. So I think, So there's I've got here. I recently was taking a course, and somebody is doing a course on inclusive interpersonal safety at work. And I just thought I'd put the link in the show notes. I haven't taken the course, and it's Bella Ikpasaja. She's running this course. She's been in this area for a very long time. And if anyone is interested, just click on the link and have a look and see, because I think that anything that helps us to think about all these different aspects, and we can't all be thinking about them all the time, but anything that starts to help us to think around that is going to be very useful, and especially the next few years, if it's when we're going to have the hardcore experimenting going on.
Definitely. I think it looks like a really interesting course. And so much of what we're talking about here relates to unconscious biases. So the only way to tackle them is to make them conscious, make them manifest. And so courses like this are a way of shining that light and making the conversations happen. So yeah, bring it on.
Yeah. Good. So the one, I mean, is there anything else that we need to say about anything that's not gender Maya, before we move on to gender?
Well, it's all part of the same conversation, really, isn't it, about this idea of biases and inequalities and how we deal with them. So I think we can carry on.
So there's an article here, and actually it's from January the 10th, 2019. A very interesting experiment I'm doing at the moment preparing for this talk is I've collated about 12 headlines on remote work from before Corona and from after Corona. And I'm going to ask people to guess when they were. Yeah. They're not going to get one. They are interchangeable. Amazing.
That's so interesting. So everything's changed, but nothing's changed at all.
Yes, completely. So this one, so this article is a couple of years old, and it might be that things have changed. I don't know. I'm interested to see what you think. And it's called "Flexible Working Can Reinforce Gender Stereotypes." And you know what? I think we might have even talked about it in the podcast. And I'm going to read a few of the things because rather than trying to summarize some of it. Okay, so men on average are more likely than women to work longer hours when given more control over them, even if it's unpaid overtime. Another study has shown that men are also more likely to worry about work when not at work and working flexibly, since men are less likely to worry about the competing care demands they face in the house, which is not the case for women. Then many women, especially mothers or those with care responsibilities, do not feel they can extend their working days. And when mothers work flexibly and work from home, studies show they increase their time and activities in the household in a way that fathers do not. And then this indicates that flexible working may even reinforce traditional gender roles, men working longer, women increasing their care duties. So what do you think, Maya? Is this still relevant?
I think it is. And I agree that this headline could have been written now just as easily as in 2019. However, I think there has been a little bit more of a moving on in terms of talking about it and recognizing this. And there are starting to be, for example, more legal protections in terms of how work can bleed into family life and the recognition that that doesn't affect people equally and so on. So yes, Galloway and everybody else is right that the pandemic accelerated things that were already happening. And some of that has accelerated the recognition that things need to change and that we can't just drift into this unexamined idea that we all work remotely because it doesn't have an equal impact on people. And flexible working does reinforce gender stereotypes, might be the headline today, or it certainly can do if we don't consciously try and mitigate it, which hopefully some places are starting to do either at the workplace level or even at the legislation level.
And the conversation is definitely more in the mainstream than it was before because of Corona as well. I also like this term. When mothers use flexible working, they're also more likely than their male colleagues to face flexibility stigma. The idea that they're less committed and less productive as a result. And I think this is, you could put remote stigma of I'm sure.
Absolutely. Or parental stigma. There's a difference between women with and without kids, or maternity stigma, for example. All of these things are easier to manage for the individual when they have flexibility, but it doesn't mean people won't use it against them.
Yeah, and I think we don't have to assume that because everyone because of everyone's come out of the same place, as in, and we're talking, of course, knowledge workers working from home, that the hybrid experiment is going to magically mean that, we don't look at people differently, regardless of where they are and how and where they're turning up and when they are working, because I think this is going to happen. It's inevitable, really. Just need to be aware of it, I suppose. So with all of that, I mean, what we're seeing is people want more flexibility. We're trying to do things in a way that doesn't leave people far behind. But every time we move towards, every time it looks like we're moving forward, we're leaving people behind. And I think that we just need to be adjusting as we go along. I think it's really difficult. But at the core is what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep people happy at work, I hope. I hope. But what happens then if we're not happy? I mean, I'm referring now to the next piece, Maya, which really looks at those people who are not happy, but they're not saying much. Maybe there's no voice. Maybe, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. And that's another inequality, is who can voice the fact that they want some change and who cannot.
Yeah, and who's listening, even if they try to. Because, I mean, the article that we'll share is a phrase that we've just seen an awful lot of all over social media in the last week or so, and it's not going to go quietly. I think it's still going to be around for a while. It's talking about, and it's an odd phrase, this phenomenon of quiet quitting, by which people aren't talking about quitting at all. They're talking about people basically staying where they are and throwing in the towel as far as effort is concerned. And that this is a phenomenon coming off the back of maybe a couple of years where people were under extraordinary circumstances and really went above and beyond. And it's reached a point where, do you know what? They're not going to bother with that anymore. They're not going to leave, maybe because they've still got bills to pay. And we were talking about the Great Resignation 6 months ago, and that was all very well, but that doesn't keep the lights on, particularly with inflation and cost of living crisis. So one alternative might be just more or less a work to rule, where people aren't making the effort anymore. I just hate the phrase quiet quitting, because it implies that the above and beyond is the norm. And simply to do what you're paid for is some kind of abdication, which just seems really wrong to me, especially when so many people made so much effort during the crisis, and they really can't be expected to do that forever.
It's like, I mean, to put it really bluntly, it's like a bomb exploded and nobody had time to fix themselves, if that's a terrible term. Nobody had time to clean the pavements. Nobody had time to put their own houses in order before we started building.
Yeah.
And there has been, what I'm feeling is there's no period during which people have had a before and an after. So during Corona, a lot of the people who could work from home were also working very long hours. So we've had first, and also we've had that division and all the psychological stuff as well. And it's just like that rhythm has continued and continued and continued. I think we saw this in a study by Microsoft at the end of the first lockdown. And we haven't stopped. And I mean, someone I know was saying, we were never thanked for continuing to work. We weren't made, we weren't furloughed. We haven't even been given like a day off to think. We haven't even been welcomed properly back.
No, like, wow. It's really, of course, that's going to build up with resentment, especially when you then combine that with inflation and cost of living, that no one's come along and said, here's a 13% salary increment either. People are exhausted. And I know that some companies self-awarely gave everybody a few days off or a mental health break and things like that. But those kind of collective high-profile actions don't necessarily address individual needs or motivations when people are burned out and exhausted or simply fed up. And maybe that's also combined with a sense of insecurity as well, that they can't just quit, or maybe don't want to get a new job right now. So maybe what people are doing is just consolidating and just kind of quietly getting on with it, but phoning it in. Maybe that's easier to do remotely. Maybe it's harder to observe and deal with as a manager very proactively in the same way that it can be more difficult to observe all sorts of performance problems and attitude problems from a distance. It's quite difficult to identify that and question it and tackle it head on. And maybe this is a kind of secret power that some remote workers have started to wield to their benefit when they haven't got power over other things.
Mm. Well, it goes back to the beginning when we're talking about finding that sense of autonomy somewhere and that sense of control somewhere. And this is another, like you were saying earlier, level of inequality as well, is that, yeah, we found, okay, I mean, the rhetoric, where we were going back, when we were going back to some kind of to the new normal, whatever that was. And there was this whole thing about the great resignation and the fact that if you don't offer remote work opportunities, then you're going to lose everyone. And it's like, well, there's some people who can't afford to leave their jobs.
Yeah.
But if they're not happy, they're going to do something.
Yeah. Or they're going to do as little as possible. If that's the only action, is to be so deliberately passive. It's really quite tragic and depressing, actually. And again, maybe it's one of those things, now we're talking about it, even if we're not using the right phrases. Maybe that will bring it into the consciousness, bring it into the conversation. It probably means a lot of more people will get accused of quiet quitting when they're actually just no longer burning the candle at both ends and
and I think
out. I don't know.
And the other thing, I mean, that I'm always so weary, and definitely since I came into the remote world as well, that there is, again, it's about what we're hearing that work should be like. It's coming from a very specific kind of work culture. And sometimes it's like, well, if you challenge that, then what, you're not committed or whatever. We're just putting work in a different place in our lives. It's very similar to the conversation we were having earlier about the social stuff. So why is it not okay just to come and do your job well? And you know where your boundaries are with your job, and you hold on to those because that's what protects you as well.
Absolutely. And, there's an awful lot of satisfaction to be had from a job well done to its limits, without any above and beyond, just done. Yes. And, maybe the problem in knowledge work is we don't always know what done looks like. We don't have those very clear edges to it that we can say, right, that's it. I have absolutely met all my expected responsibilities for this day or this shift or this project, and I can turn it in and walk away. But that should be fine. Actually, that's not quitting. It's not laziness. It's your job. It's the bit you're being paid for. And that should be a reward in itself. And I think for some people it is, but maybe for too long we've idealized and fetishized this hustle culture where you have to be thinking like a startup or like an entrepreneur the whole time in order to be a good employee. And actually, some people aren't getting paid enough for that, or they're not getting enough reward or incentive, but they can still do an excellent job on the completely meeting their responsibilities level. And we ought to be fine with that.
Wow. Oh, well, we could go on for this is, I mean, for me, it's interesting. I know some people listen to podcasts for the how-to, and that's definitely not what you get here. But I think that I always feel like a modern philosopher, where you just like and going through the lens of work to expand out into society and and then the individual and what I find it fascinating. Shall we wrap up with this article, which is still under the flexibility umbrella, and I suppose trying to look for better workplaces, and that actually has a wider remit than the remote worker, which is about the 4-day week. And we talked about
this. A little bit positive to wrap up on the end. Yes. Quite a depressing episode, but some bits are going fairly well for some people.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, the tone has been a bit depressing, but actually we have to be realistic, because we come on this show like all the remote advocates and we always say, yeah, this and that. And actually we do need to stop and say, okay, where's the dark side? Because there's always one. So now we've got it off our chest. The next episode's going to be all, but this is wonderful. So although I also have my issues with this, it's under the work-life balance section of The Guardian, and the title is, I had a very welcome line on Friday, the joys and challenges of switching to a 4-day week. Workers at 70 companies are taking an extra day off each week on full pay as part of a UK-wide trial. We asked 4 of them how they found the first month. How did they find it, Maya?
Well, they enjoyed their lie-ins, actually. And all power to them. I mean, I think that's fantastic. It shows that these are fairly small changes in people's lives that can drastically increase the quality of it. And that's, one of the reasons that we've been banging on about remote work for years and how awesome it is because of having choice over things like something as fundamental as when you wake up in the morning. But it sounds like there are definitely people gaining benefits from it. Others are questioning it and wondering, what it means for the structure of their life and their habits and so on. And others are feeling that it's a very natural way of working now and they don't want the pilot to end. So yes, hopefully, obviously, this is going to be counterbalanced at the end of the pilot. Somebody's going to evaluate the work productivity and say, has this actually been a success or not? And sadly, it will probably get measured in those terms a great deal from an economic point of view as to whether people were able to be as productive over 4 days as they were over 5. So I hope that people remember these personal anecdotes as well, what people gain from it.
Yeah, and we go back to when we discussed this article not long ago. The initial article, and we said that one of the reasons for this experiment was the well-being aspect, and that was being spelled out. So I hope that when we're looking at productivity, we can also look at the cost of not doing it. As in, hopefully we have healthier employees, which means less absent and actually people doing a better job while they're working. So I hope that will be there. What I found really interesting was 2 things. It's only a month. There's a quote right at the beginning which says it took us 100 years to move from 6-day week to 5. This is a month. And
yes.
What I see, apart from that, I think it's going to take, it's a bit like remote work. When you first start working away from your colleagues, you have one experience and 6 months later it's a different experience. And what I did, and going back to that relationship, what we think we should be at work like and stuff, I find a sense of guilt for taking an extra day off throughout.
There's clearly people are still kind of in a bit of a holiday honeymoon phase with the whole thing. And it's, going to have my Friday fun lists, so like a bank holiday every week and things. They haven't adjusted.
Yes. And I didn't expect that. I found that really interesting. I understand it and I empathize completely, but I find it very interesting. And I wanted to quote, just because someone says, perhaps the biggest shift in mindset has come from Adia, and who says, I'm surprised I've enjoyed this month. I usually never like to be idle. It felt as if I had withdrawal from work initially, and it's such a large part of giving my life meaning, she says. But I just needed to get more comfortable with what I can achieve in a limited time and to say a resounding no when I can't complete something to the standard I want to. The psychology behind the 4-day week is also amazing.
It's so complex, isn't it? And gosh, that 5-day week is so ground into us in ways that maybe we never really even understood. And the trouble is we need a much longer pilot, really, because it's clear that this hasn't been time for people to make, not for everybody to make that shift in their minds and really adapt to concentrating the work things you're paid for into 4 days and the rest of your life into 3 in a more interesting, balanced way that doesn't have to feel like you're on holiday or not wasting time or not being idle. And I don't know, I feel people need longer to really find that balance that they're comfortable with.
Yeah, I wonder if 6 months is enough. I would have liked it to be a year with a big evaluation after the 6 months and I think you're right. I'm not sure 6 months is enough, but we'll see.
We'll come back in 100 years.
Yes. See. I will say, there used to be this debate and, by then maybe we'll back to 6 days a week by then. I don't know. I'm not very optimistic today.
You're not, anyway. Come on, this is happy. Most of these people are happier than they were.
Yes.
And they can see something positive come out of it, even if there are surprising things for them.
The one thing, when we were talking earlier about all the headlines that could be pre-corona or now, and the one thing that has changed, I think, is the mindset shift of you cannot work away from each other and this is a set way of working to actually there isn't. And there's different ways of working. And that's why the 4-day week, although I think it is too early to bring it in after everything we've been through, but actually maybe now is the time to really push for it because people are open to different things.
Yes, so we can just kind of build on that momentum, and who knows, maybe we'll be properly trialing async working in another year's time, or is that too much to expect? And we can, all these different dimensions of flexibility that people are starting to realize exists. In even the 4-day work week at the very end of it, Aya is talking about how it might open up opportunities for her to study or have a family and things like that, which could be much better managed around achieving the same results, but not necessarily over 4 distinct days. So maybe this is all just part of a conversation where people realize everything there is to gain by taking back the way they work and live their lives. So I think this is optimistic. And so I'm glad we've circled back after some fairly bleak territory.
And maybe for sorry, I interrupted what you said then.
No, just that I'm glad we've brought this idea of inequality and autonomy back to something a little bit positive at the end, hopefully.
Yeah, and hopefully this conversation for those of us who have that flexibility and autonomy, maybe going through some of these issues and solving some of that then can extend a lot further. Right. Well, listeners, if you stuck with us, congratulations. We'd love to hear what you have to say about this conversation. And of course, we've missed out a lot of stuff. There was loads more to talk about, but this is where we are today. And Maya, I love that you point out that actually we have ended up on a positive note. So remember that if you're listening to this on the website, you can subscribe to the 21st Century Work Life on your favorite podcast app. You can sign up to our monthly newsletter with reading and listening recommendations, plus a digest of our own content over at virtualnotdistant.com. Follow us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and if you want to use good old-fashioned email, please email me directly, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. Thank you to Ross, who will be polishing up the episode. Anything else you want to say to listeners before we wrap up, Maya?
No, I know you're going to be listening to this in September, and by the time we come back again in October, it feels like that will be quite a long distance from when we've recorded this. Yes. So wishing everybody a good late summer, early autumn, and we'll look forward to regrouping and seeing how these themes have moved on.
Thank you very much for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work Life podcast. We know there are many other shows for you to choose from. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Ortiz. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.